My name is Emily Rowland, and I'm from the Political Science Department at Midwestern State University. In this study, I focus on the rural and urban divide in American society. By using political efficacy, I explain the gap between rural and urban residents. To begin, I'll provide some background information on how the rural and urban divide is becoming increasingly polarized, especially in current times. The urban and rural divide has been widely discussed since the 2016 presidential election, as it has caused a large polarization between residents in rural and urban areas. National elections are increasingly characterized by rural residents supporting Republican candidates and urban residents backing Democratic candidates. However, the division between these two people are not based on consistent sets of values, but on an us versus them mentality and animosity toward the other groups. It has become a team sport rather than a clash of competing ideas or values. Rural residents resent urban residents because they perceive that government caters to the interest of urban residents at their expense. Urban residents resent rural residents because they believe that rural residents have a disproportionate impact on electoral results relative to their size. With this said, this resentment and divide can be detrimental to American democracy. That is why it is important to understand why there is division between these two areas to decrease polarization and bring unity to the nation. To explain the gap between the urban and rural residents, I use political efficacy. By definition, political efficacy is the feeling that one can or potentially can have influence on the political process. More recent scholars have identified two types of political efficacy. External efficacy refers to one's perception of the government's responsiveness to public need, and internal efficacy refers to one's personal belief that they are knowledgeable enough to participate in politics. There has been lots of research done on political efficacy in association with individual behavior, such as voter turnout, weak party identification, and exposure to political information. Along with this, it has been studied with social and economic factors such as race, modern-day access to political information, and income. Existing studies on political efficacy have focused heavily on individuals' political efficacy and paid less attention to the community context that might influence this. This is important to realize because there are other factors beyond individual influences, such as community and social contexts, that are continuously affecting people's political efficacy. Events such as elections, negative and positive community interactions, and changing political culture are all contributing factors to political efficacy. The different political atmospheres of rural and urban areas influence efficacy, and as polarization increases, it creates the us versus them mentality that I previously touched on. Therefore, this study examines how people's political efficacies are different based on the community type in which they live in, such as a city, suburb, small town, or rural area, which is important given the intensifying divide between rural and urban areas. The 2020 American National Election Study has enabled this study by providing nationwide survey data with over 8,000 American respondents. The data provided respondents' community types as well as their external and internal political efficacy. Furthermore, the survey asked people's perceived political influence of small towns and rural areas compared to cities and suburbs. As demonstrated in Figure 1, our preliminary analysis generally indicated a division between cities/suburbs and small towns/rural areas. 44% of city and suburban residents chose about the right amount, while 55% of small town and rural residents answered that they have too little influence on the government. Approximately 20% of urban and suburban residents answered that small towns and rural residents have too much influence on the government, while only 8% of small town and rural area residents agreed. However, division between two areas is not clear in all of the categories, and we need to know how these perceptions as groups are associated with their political efficacy, external and internal, controlling for other socioeconomic factors, which requires a more structured statistical analysis. As previously mentioned, I obtained data through the American National Election Survey website and carefully chose my variables. We then had to recode variables because they were coded in ways that were harder to interpret. I used the 2020 American National Election Survey, which was the most recently published data set at the time. The survey was conducted on August 18th, 2020 through January 3rd of 2021 using web-only, web plus phone, and video web plus phone platforms to conduct it. The total of 10,225 responded the survey request, and the response rates were 41.2% for the web-only mode, 44.2% for the web plus phone mode, and 31% for video, web, and phone mode. The main output variables, or independent variables, that we used are the respondents' external and internal efficacies. For external efficacies, Ains asked the two questions. Public officials don't care much about what people like me think, and people like me don't have any say about what the government does. The respondents were asked to choose among the 5 suggested answers: agree strongly, agree somewhat, neither agree nor disagree, disagree somewhat, disagree strongly. These answers to the questions were all averaged. For the internal efficacy, 2 questions were asked. How often do politics and government seem so complicated that you can't understand what's going on? And how well do you understand the important political issues facing our countries? The responses to these 2 questions were averaged as well. For the independent variable, the American National Election Survey also asked, compared to people living in cities, do people living in small towns and rural areas have too much influence, too little influence, or about the right amount of influence on government? 7 answers were suggested: too little, coded as 1, somewhat too little, coded as 2, a little too little, coded as 3, about the right amount was coded as 4, a little too much, coded as 5, and somewhat too much, coded as 6, and much too much, which was coded as 7. In the following analysis, this variable is used both as an output variable and an explanatory variable. As other explanatory variables for the rural and urban context, the American National Election Survey asked the respondents if they currently lived in a rural or urban area. 4 community types were suggested. City was coded 1, suburb was coded 2, small town was coded as 3, and rural area was coded as 4. For our regression analysis, we included other control variables such as age, race, income, education, and sex. Table 2 provides a matrix based on Pearson's correlation. The variance inflation factor was calculated for multicollinearity, and all regression models showed less than 2, which is acceptable in most social science studies. So we created a regression model for perceived influence of small towns and rural areas on government to understand perceptions of government influence. Here are the results of the regression. This table shows how urban and rural residents perceive their influence on the government. The positive coefficient for city residents indicates that, compared to suburban residents, Residents of cities tend to believe that small towns and rural areas have too much influence on the government. On the contrary, the negative coefficients for the residents of small towns and rural areas indicate that residents of small towns and rural areas tended to believe that they have too little influence on the government. Finally, the coefficient of the rural areas were larger than that of those of the small towns, meaning that the residents of rural areas believed more strongly than the residents of small towns that their influence on the government was too little. In the control variables, older respondents believe that small towns have little influence, while wealthy and higher educated respondents believe that rural areas have too much influence. Female respondents compared to males and Republicans compared to Democrats believe that small towns have too little influence, and compared to whites and blacks, blacks believe that small towns and rural areas have little influence on the government. In the next step, the respondents' external and internal efficacies were regressed on community type and perceived influence of small towns and rural areas. 3 models were structured for external and internal efficacies. Here are the findings. The negative coefficients for small towns and rural areas indicate that residents of small towns and rural areas have significantly lower external efficacies than the residents of suburban areas. This difference was not statistically significant for residents of cities and suburban areas, showing that small towns and rural areas have quite different perceptions than that of urban areas. Also, the perceived influence of small towns and rural areas showed that people who believe that small towns and rural areas have much influence on the government tended not to have higher levels of external efficacy than people who did not. However, internal efficacy did not show a strong statistical difference, meaning that the division between rural and urban areas has to do with government responsiveness rather than their own understanding of politics. People who believed that small towns and rural areas have much influence on the government tend to have higher levels of external efficacy than those who did not, even among residents of small towns and rural areas. This brings the interesting question: why do people in urban areas believe that small towns have more influence if their external efficacy is much higher than that of rural areas? To conclude, the results of this study showed that 1. Residents of cities and suburbs tended to believe that small towns and rural areas had much influence on the government, while the small town and rural area residents disagreed. Small town and rural areas demonstrated low levels of external efficacies than cities and suburban areas. And finally, the respondents who believed that small towns and rural areas have much influence on government tended to show higher levels of external efficacy. These findings indicate a paradox in American society, where people who believe that rural areas have much influence on government, who are more likely to be urban or suburban residents, feel more strongly that government is responsive to their own voices than people who did not. This may mean that resentment from urban and rural residents is not from one side, especially from the rural side, which is different from what many urban residents believe.